Now, this lesson is the next lesson in Unit 1 of Richard and John. Now, what this lesson's focusing on is how Richard and John raised revenue, how they raised money. So we need to understand how they both used certain things to make money for themselves and their kingdom during their reigns. Now, we are at the bottom of point 3 where it says royal revenue. Revenue is money. And we're going to look at in this lesson the Royal Demesnes, the role of sheriffs, feudal incidents, scutage, tax on movables and income. Now, this is probably going to be one of the more challenging lessons because there's so many different words that you may not have heard of in today's society. So the key thing is I'm going to go through each one just to explain it in a lot of detail, and you need to have an understanding of around 3 to 5 facts on each. But before we do that, we need to have an understanding, yes, how did Richard and John raise money? But before you go on to the first task, why would Richard and John need to raise money? Now, both kings needed to raise money for different things, okay? For Richard needed to raise money for a crusade, a war against the Muslims to get back Jerusalem. Both men would have needed money to raise, needed money for war. Now, both men, during their reigns, were at war with France at one time or another against Philip. And this was to get back land that he had taken. Okay, we're going to look at that in a lot more detail later. Both men would also use, actually what I'll do before I do that, crusade, I'll put as Richard. War is both mercenaries, foreign soldiers. So sometimes the kings would have needed to pay for soldiers to come into their army if the tenants-in-chief didn't raise enough soldiers. Now, mercenaries were very skilled foreign soldiers. They would have been quite expensive, so Richard and John would have needed to raise taxes to pay for these men. You also needed money to keep your castles well protected, because castles were the most defensive areas that needed to be kept hold of. Equipment, you know, the siege machines, the battering rams, the trebuchets, they needed equipment to actually fight. They needed equipment like ships to be able to get to areas like Normandy to be able to fight. They also needed money for their own personal wealth, and they also needed money to keep their barons happy. The barons are the tenants-in-chief on the feudal system. So the first task you need to do is I'm going to go through different ways that Richard and John raised money. I'm going to look at the Royal Demesnes, tallage, wardship fines, forest fines, profits of justice, scutage, tax on movables and income, and the role of sheriffs. For each one, you need to write 3 to 5 facts about it. Now, the question that you would get in the exam on this is more than likely going to be a describe 2 features question. So you need to have 2 extended facts about these. So, the Royal Demesnes, what is it? Now, I'm going to go through this as slowly as I can to make sure that you get it. But the Royal Demesnes was the land that the king kept. He kept 20% of the land for as royal land as he liked to hunt. Now, the Royal Demesnes provided the king with money. Anyone that fell or lived within the Royal Demesnes had to pay rent to the king for his own living. So basically, if the king chose a piece of land that people lived in, the money that those people paid for rent went directly to the king that would help him to live in times of peace. Now, the royal land, the Royal Demesnes, now another word for Demesnes is the royal land, okay, was made up of royal hunting forests, royal manorial estates with villages and towns. The king would make a lot of money from anyone who lived in these areas which were on his land. So anyone that lived on the Royal Demesnes, all the money went to the king, and the king made a lot of money from this land. The king could make a lot of money through owning a town. He could charge rent to people living in towns and collected taxes off people who sold goods in them. Don't forget, in a town, you've also got markets and everything along those lines. I'm going to add something else to the Royal Demesnes, but the king also made money from people who broke the rules in the Royal Demesnes. Such as people who hunted, they could be fined. Okay, so the king made money from people who didn't follow the rules within his land. So one way that the king raised money was through the Royal Demesnes. The second way the king raised money was through tallage. Now, tallage links to the Royal Demesnes. Tallage is a land tax. So if you paid a tallage, it was a tax on land which was paid by anyone living in the Royal Demesnes, including those who lived in royal towns. This included townsmen and peasants. Now, this tax on royal land was only paid by lower classes. And it wasn't paid by barons or knights. They had different taxes that they had to consider, that they had to pay. But a tallage could be demanded by the king or the lord of the manor for no reason whatsoever. So if a king demanded a tallage of the people within his area, then they had to pay it, or they could lose their land, they could lose their rights, they could be seriously punished. There was no fixed amount of the tallage, so the amounts could change. So it's very different to our country today, whereas there's certain percentages of tax. Sometimes the tallage could be very, very high, which could put people in a really difficult position. So just remember, with the tallage, it's basically a tax that the king demanded whenever he needed it, and it was for people who were living on the royal land. Now, I'm going to confuse things just a little bit here. There were another group who paid tallage whenever the king wanted. Jewish people. And Jewish people paid a tallage to the king whenever he asked for it. Why? Because the king promised to protect Jewish people. We're going to look at that a lot more in future lessons, but this caused a lot of problems in society because Christians felt like the king was cheating them at times by protecting the Jews. But Jewish people also paid tallages. So townsmen, peasants, and Jewish people would pay a tallage to the king whenever he asked. Now, the next one is a mixture, okay? I'm going to go through 4 here, and you have to write facts on all 4 of them. But all 4 of these fall under something called a feudal incident. Now, I've said what a feudal incident is. A feudal incident is when the king calls upon their vassal to make payments. So just remember, in England, in this time period, you had the feudal system. I'm going to just remind you of what the feudal system is. At the top, you had the king. The king would lend land to the tenants in chief. They became the king's vassal. Then the tenants in chief would lend land to the knights, and then the knights would have to do a job and they'd become a vassal. It might help if I spell it right, getting rid of one of the L's. The knights would also become a vassal. Now, if you are a vassal, if the king demands a payment, then they would have to pay it, okay? Now, basically, feudal incidents are taxes that are paid for by these 2 groups here, the tenants in chief and the knights, right? So, the first one is a wardship fine. Now, I'm going to read through this. If a baron dies while his heir was underage, so in this time period, if a man had a son, then when the baron dies, the son would take over, the eldest son would take over his land, his titles, his money. Now, but sometimes they had to be a certain age, okay? If a baron died while their child was under the age to take the land, the baron's land would be given to the king. The heir and his siblings became wards of the king. So basically, the king looked after them until the heir became old enough to help look after his own siblings. The king was responsible for the heir and his siblings until they became adults. The king decided where they live, their education, and their training. This is known as wardship. So basically, the king became the ward, not the owner, but he looked after the children as they were until they became old enough. In return, the king would keep the money the land made until the heir became an adult. So this is good for the king, because while he's looking after the children, all the money that the land makes, he is getting. That's good for the king. Now, when the son becomes an adult, he had to buy his land back from the king, and this was known as a wardship fine. Okay, now that's basically, say for example, if someone's looking after something of mine, and when I become old enough, I have to pay for it to get it back. The king makes double whammy here. He makes money on the land while the heir isn't old enough, and he makes money on the land when the heir's old enough, because the heir has to buy it back. Now, John was very unfair with this, as he would charge huge amounts to get the land. He would charge a large amount to the heir. So at times it was very difficult for the heir to pay it back. So in this respect, if they couldn't pay it back, then the king would keep the land, which means the king would profit from it. The king made a lot of money from wardship. He could fine on the marriage of his ward, and he could organise the dead baron's wife to be remarried. So basically, the king had a lot of control over the family until the heir was old enough. Now that one is very difficult to get your head around. So just all you got to remember is, baron dies, king takes control of the land. The reason he takes control of the land is because the son isn't old enough. The king looks after the children, and when the son becomes old enough, he will buy the land back. Some kings, for example, John, took advantage of that and charged a lot more, which means he would possibly keep hold of the land, okay? The next one, forest fines. Now, the forest land was under the protection of the king. If anyone was living, working, hunting, and collecting food on forest land, then the king could fine them. Okay, you weren't allowed to live, work, hunt, and collect food on the forest land. John increased forest fines and made them very difficult to pay. Richard was very fair with them. John increased them quite dramatically. So the forest fine's very simple. If you're in the forest, living, working, hunting, collecting food, you would be charged. You could be seriously punished. If you were caught hunting deer, one of the punishments could be you have your eyes gouged out. So it could be quite a harsh punishment. But the way in which they made money from it was they fined people who were found in the forest. Profits of justice. The king could make money from people who committed a crime. Now, the cases were started when people paid for a writ, which was a court document to get someone to court. The problem was sometimes, and this was mainly John sometimes sold justice so it could benefit him. For example, he once supported someone because they offered him 3 horses in return for his support. So sometimes it was mainly King John. He would cheat the system by offering people less punishment if they pay him. Because he was the controller of justice, he was basically being unfair with this. Whereas Richard didn't really cheat the system. Richard was away for the majority of the time anyway, but John cheated the system. And if people thought they could get out of a punishment, they would pay John, and knew that if the bribe was good, John would get them out of it. The next one, scutage. Scutage helped Richard and John raise more men for an army. Now, if you were a tenant-in-chief, you had to raise an army to keep your land. If you didn't raise enough men, you had to pay a scutage of 10 marks per night. So say, for example, I was a baron and Richard has told me to get an army of 100 men, but I only get 90. I would have to pay Richard a fine of 100 marks because I didn't get a full army. Scutages were also paid by knights, so they didn't have to fight. So some knights could pay a scutage to not fight. Well, why is that good? Because it means that Richard and John can pay for mercenaries if they are low on numbers. Okay. King John did take advantage of scutages. He demanded 11 scutages in 16 years. So he asked the tenants-in-chief to raise an army that many times in 16 years. It almost became a yearly tax, and it became very difficult for the tenants-in-chief to raise an army that often. Now, the next way in which King John raised money was by a tax called the Tax on Movables and Incomes, and this was known as the 13th. One thing you'll learn about King John is that he was very demanding with money. He was always asking for more because he never had enough. He was always at war. He was definitely more financially worse off than Richard. So in 1207, he developed a new method of tax. He demanded a tax which was based on the goods and the income of every man. Basically, a tax on how much you were worth. If you were richer, brilliant, John's going to make more money from you. He claimed this money was to help get Normandy back in France. Normandy raised a lot of money for his empire, but the problem was John had lost Normandy to King Philip. So John used this to try and raise an army big enough to get Normandy back. The tax was set at 1 shilling for every mark. A mark was worth 13 shillings, so the tax became known as the 13th. Failure to pay led to harsh punishments, including prison and losing your land. And in 1207, John raised £60,000 from the 13th, but it was so unpopular that he didn't do it again. So this was sort of a one-off tax, a one-off way of making money. But John made £60,000, which, we put it into the grand scheme of things, a king makes about £15,000 a year income. So John managed to get about 4 years' worth of income on one tax. And the last thing is the role of the sheriffs. Now, the sheriffs were individuals that collected taxes from the royal land. Now, we might think of sheriffs as people with, like, you know, America. We might think of people like Woody from Toy Story, but this is totally different. The sheriffs collected the money. Now, if you think to the film Robin Hood, you've got the Sheriff of Nottingham who goes around collecting the taxes. Now, sheriffs were very different. Now, in Richard's time, he used a method known as tax farming. This meant that the sheriff was given a target. So say, for example, the sheriff had a target of £100 to collect. If the sheriff collected £110, he could keep the £10. Richard only wanted the money that he expected. Okay, so anything extra, the sheriff could keep, which means that sheriffs could become really wealthy. Now, Richard made a lot of money before the Crusade because he sold jobs to people in England. And the job of the sheriff was very popular. Lots of people wanted it because they knew it would make you very wealthy. The system of tax farming also continued under John, but John didn't like it because he didn't want people becoming too wealthy. So he asked for more money from the sheriffs in terms of tax to stop them becoming too wealthy and powerful. But John did use the sheriffs to be very forceful. John used the sheriffs to be very aggressive to collect money off people, because in John's time, John asked for more money than Richard. Okay? So, the next task, after you've done facts on all of these, like task 1, all you've got to do is answer this exam question. Describe 2 features of royal revenue, royal money. Remember, it needs to be 4 to 5 lines long. It needs to be a big, extended fact. So if you develop this answer, if you write this down and send it to me, I'll mark them and let you know how much it would have got out of 4. So going back to the purpose of today's lesson, we have done royal revenue. We've looked at the Royal Demesnes, the role of the sheriffs, feudal incidences, scutages, and the 13th, the tax on movables and income. Remember, the tasks of this lesson: write 3 to 5 facts about each of these ways of making money. Then complete the 4-mark exam question. That's the tasks for this lesson.